Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. There's an uproar in the British press over a decision by Magdalen College's Middle Common Room to remove a portrait of the Queen. Her Majesty, the student body agreed, represents an institution responsible for much of colonialism throughout history and the modern era. At the same time, opinion polls tell us the Queen is the most popular member of the royal family. What are we to believe? Has the monarchy had its day? Or is it one of the things that keep us Brits glued together? And what happens once she's gone? Today we have Matthew Dennison, the author of a new biography of the Queen, simply titled The Queen, to discuss all of that, and of course his new book. Hello and welcome, Matthew.
Hello.
This is an opportunity to look at the Queen's life. It's an obvious thing to say that the monarchy and her personality are bound up in each other. So the biography is a useful way to remind ourselves how she has shaped the role. I say this because I think we seem to have taken her character for granted, a character you could put in marked contrast with the excesses and extremes of kings and queens that have gone before her, and possibly a character in contrast with the norms of today. Matthew, can we start at the beginning? It's an obvious but important thing to say that this is someone who was born in 1926 and had an upbringing that was very different from one any of us would recognize, I think. How was she brought up, and can you say something about her education? Matthew.
Yes, well, it would appear, wouldn't it, that the Queen is a relic of a vanished world. And part of the Queen's achievement is her fidelity to values that were ingrained in that very distant childhood. Mostly, I think, because she's never seen any reason to review the standards of good behavior that were ingrained in her by her parents and her grandparents. Unusually, the Queen was famous from birth. It tends to be an idea that the Queen's life changed in 1936 with the abdication and her father's accession to the throne. But in fact, the Queen herself, as Princess Elizabeth, was never out of the limelight. She lived her childhood very much as an object of popular interest, albeit in that interwar period, she was an object of respectful adulation, that being the treatment that the royal family received. Essentially, her upbringing was that of a privileged member of the upper classes. And what is interesting about the Queen's childhood that hasn't necessarily been the case subsequently, until perhaps the children of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, is that her childhood actually followed a pattern that was remarkably similar to those of the aristocratic friends of her parents. The Duke and Duchess of York, the Queen's parents, lived at a large townhouse on Piccadilly. They had neighbours, the Allendales, who also had children who lived in a similar fashion, and friends across London who lived similarly. So the Queen's childhood, albeit it included extraordinary events, for example, taking part in her grandfather George V's Silver Jubilee, nevertheless had points of connection with that of other aristocratic or upper class children in the capital. And it was an upbringing that was shaped by the gender politics of the time. Essentially, the educational regime that the Queen's mother and her governess put in place was one that reflects really ideas of women's role at that time. And so aside from academic studies, the Queen acquired any number of what we might call ladylike accomplishments. And the amount of time that ladylike accomplishments consumed in her timetable was every bit as significant as anything that emerged from a book. Having said that, of course, these things have been significant in the Queen's life as sovereign. You know, there are moments in the Queen's public life when the fact that she is a good dancer and enjoys dancing has been a useful part of her diplomatic arsenal. So although it was an education that by modern standards was light on academic study, it wasn't so surprising at the time. And it was an education that surprisingly did equip her for a number of things that have happened since. I think though, what is so, I'm sorry, Nicholas, I think what is so important to remember was that the Queen grew up in a number of ways. She grew up as a child like any other child, learning about the world and learning about herself and what life meant. But she also grew up as a royal. She learned to curtsy before she was 2, for example. She learned to maneuver between the royal drawing room, because she spent a great deal of time with her grandparents, George V and Queen Mary, and a nursery world that wasn't radically dissimilar from that of other children.
And obviously a childhood imbued with a sense of duty, and that wouldn't necessarily be exceptional for somebody of that background as well either.
Well, I think what we're talking about here is a kind of pre-celebrity period of still hierarchical society in Britain, where it is the case that aristocrats and royals are the celebrities of the time. If you wanted to have some kind of charitable event, then you would ask your local grandee to open that, or perhaps to head the committee for it. And so a sense then, I guess, old-fashioned noblesse oblige, the idea that privilege brings with it responsibility and duty. Remember, for the Queen's early childhood, both her parents carried out what by modern standards was a very light program of public engagements. So in fact, a code that she absorbs that is important to her is really the code that her mother has in turn absorbed from her own parents, the Strathmores, and that is simply an old-fashioned paternalistically conservative view of the privileged in society, taking care of and acting for the benefit of the less privileged.
She's got a tremendous work ethic, and I think we do have to. I said this in the introduction. We do have to remind ourselves that the Queen is perhaps exceptional in that she's been so constant throughout her reign. If you compare that to perhaps the depression of Queen Victoria, or the excesses of the Georges, or madness, or whatever. In a way, her reign has been unusual because of that consistency, but that also comes from and that tone is set at an early age.
I think that the key to that is that the Queen is personally a modest person. What she particularly absorbed from her grandparents was an idea of the importance of the crown, of the throne, of the institution of monarchy, an attitude that certainly on Queen Mary's part was deeply reverent. Queen Mary certainly reviewed the throne as a sacrosanct, and the Queen, I think, has that understanding of the throne as something special. And in her case, what that seems to mean is that she has been happy to subsume her personality in the responsibilities of the role. And I genuinely think, based on the research that I did, that for the Queen, there is this position of sovereign, there is the idea of monarchy, and then there is herself as current incumbent of the throne and current guardian of monarchy. And there seems to me a clear idea that the crown is more important than she herself is. Which is why, for example, we don't hear the Queen protesting that she must do things her way, she must be her own person. I think she has sacrificed what we all may take for granted as the relative freedom to be our own person in order to fulfill the role of sovereign to the very best of her ability as she understands it.
You talk in your book, you write in the book about her, I think it's her first overseas trip, which is an enormous one, which is a tour of the Commonwealth, which sort of exemplifies what you were talking about.
Yeah, so 173 days away from her children, who at the time are 5 and 3. Well, that is an enormous wrench for any mother. And I think partly because of unfavorable comment that was made in the difficult years of the mid-90s, that we still retain some idea of the Queen as somebody who was a cold mother. But she cried putting her children to bed the last night before the departure for that tour. She was reported by crowds at the airport as being unfriendly when she got out of her car and got onto the plane to embark for that tour. That was because she was deeply upset at leaving the children behind. If you look at the tours that she made throughout the course of the speeches rather she made throughout the course of that tour, she frequently refers to missing her children and the pleasure that she will derive from being reunited with them, with King Idris of Libya towards the end of the tour. So yes, considerable sacrifices, because at that point she is herself Lilibet, but she is also the sovereign. She is mother and wife, but maternal duties at that point are not compatible with this new burden of head of the Commonwealth.
There is a pattern that we're all familiar with now. And this really emerges, I guess, from the late 1980s onwards, and perhaps even earlier than that, where while she has this consistent sense of duty and there's no scandal associated with her, those around her are doing other things. I mean, one could talk about Margaret, but perhaps a distraction compared with what happens with Charles and Diana, and then Andrew and Fergie. Can you just talk about how you see the pressure being brought upon the monarchy, and when does that begin, and how does that affect it?
Well, there is criticism of the monarchy throughout the Queen's reign, so it would be wrong for us to assume that it all goes swimmingly and then suddenly in 1992 all hell breaks loose. The Queen is fundamentally a pragmatist. She is a practical person, and it seems to me a little bit like Elizabeth I. She has set out to please the largest number of people for the majority of the time, but has always recognized that there will be some people who will criticize, and with an increasingly vociferous press in less deferential society, that criticism can be more barbed, perhaps less guarded than it was. And we know that criticism emerged in the late 50s. We all remember Altrincham and those criticisms. There is criticism in the 60s. This then sort of reverses itself slightly. By the late 60s, there's been such seismic social change in Britain that people are already beginning to value the stability and constancy that the Queen represents. And she has continued to fulfill that role. Having said that, arguably that's not so difficult for the remainder of her family. The Queen has a very clear role, and the role is unrelenting. She is 24/7, 365 days a year, the sovereign. So the path is there for her. For somebody like Princess Margaret, it's much less clear, the expectation. The development of monarchy throughout the 20th century and then on into the 21st century has been what constitutional historians refer to as a welfare monarchy. So essentially a monarchy shorn of most of its political power that is promoting philanthropy and good works in the voluntary sector. That's not always frightfully exciting, is it? And I think there have been moments when, for different members in her family, that hasn't been sufficiently fulfilling as a life program. But I think at that point, we take off our hats and applaud the Queen, who has not allowed herself not to be fulfilled by that. And it's not because she has always been wildly excited at the job set before her. She said to President Sarkozy of France in 2008 that there have been moments when she's been bored. She just wouldn't allow herself ever to show that.
The problem, I guess, is that, as you pointed out, this is a constitutional monarchy. It's part of the state. It's part of the way the United Kingdom functions, as indeed it's linked to other countries around the world, for whom perhaps it's easier to sever ties with the monarchy, but it's inherently part of our political setup. And along with that, there's an aura of mystique, perhaps. It's something that you can't go, you have to have it at a distance, and almost an ethereal nature that has surrounded the Queen, in that she's not like us. And because of that, we have this respect for it. But that begins to break down, and certainly it's breaking down with the next generation. So how do you see that developing? Isn't that a problem?
It doesn't need to be a problem, because some of that aura goes with what the Princess of Wales referred to as the top job. The Queen has an aura that is partly because she is the Queen. I have every confidence that when in time the Prince of Wales becomes king, he will have that aura that is an aspect of sovereignty, some tiny residue in some way of that Shakespearean idea of the divinity that doth hedge a king. The Queen has made the monarchy much more accessible than it was in previous reigns, often having to fight her formidable mother to do so. The Queen Mother, for example, was dead set against the idea of opening Buckingham Palace to the public as a way of both showing accessibility and raising funds in the aftermath of the Windsor Castle fire. The Queen Mother felt that was simply undignified. But part of the Queen's achievement is that she has granted greater accessibility whilst never compromising her personal dignity. But part of that, I think, comes back to this idea of the seriousness with which she regards monarchy as a calling. She takes being queen seriously, and somehow I think we take that from her. She does what Prince Charles described as dressing up and queening it. If you look at early official photographs of the Queen going right on into the 70s, overwhelmingly, the photographic sessions that she commissioned, she is wearing a tiara, she's wearing the garter, she's wearing orders and decorations and significant historic jewelry and state dress. She promoted herself as monarch, not as person, and I think very successfully so. I think there is nobody who regards the Queen simply as another old woman. I think she has this absolute specialness. And of course, another aspect of that is the fact that she hasn't unburdened herself. The Queen is at the same time the best known woman on earth and probably one of the least well-known women on earth. You know, her the bust by Arnold Machin on our postage stamps is the most reproduced work of art in world history. And yet the thoughts going on within that profile are unknown to all of us.
I'd love to start getting some questions from people. So if you can start putting your questions in the Q&A box below or wherever it is on your screen, just type them in there and then we'll start putting them to Matthew. I want to move on to the next generation before we start taking those questions. So firstly, William and Kate, if you talk about that transition from being approachable personalities, mucking around with their friends, partying, whatever, to assuming those roles. I assume you're going to say that they're ready to step into those roles. They're sort of taking on that role in a very professional way.
I think they are happy with the role that they're currently fulfilling. I don't think that they would say they were ready for any greater role at this moment. I think that they are more fortunate than the Queen in that they have this period to bring up their children without the pressures of sovereignty. And I think they're probably profoundly grateful for that. There's much talk about the Cambridges doing things differently, but something that we forget that I noticed in sources is that when the Queen was first married and carrying out engagements as Princess Elizabeth with the Duke of Edinburgh, they were referred to almost universally as Elizabeth and Philip. Several years later, they accede to the throne. She accedes to the throne. At no point is she then referred to as Elizabeth. He goes on being referred to as Philip sometimes, but at that point, the Queen becomes the Queen. So, we are used to a certain amount of informality at the moment at Kensington Palace, William and Catherine, but I don't know if that would survive the jump to sovereignty.
I mean, do you think the way the court works, do you think the monarchy can change? I mean, it's I guess the point is that it has each monarch, each period in history has had a very different kind of monarchy, a very different kind of court. So there's no reason to say that the current court can't adapt and become more informal and
no, and the current court already has adapted. So it is the case that the Queen essentially took on a fairly Victorian court machinery and court personnel. But among the many people I spoke to was somebody who'd been an equerry in the mid-70s, and when he was preparing to hand over to his successor after 2 years in office, he, as every equerry before him had done, got out the notes to give to his successor, which he would update. And he expected this to involve, sort of low-level updating in certain areas. He found that he had to rewrite those notes because court procedure, even in those 2 years in the mid-70s, had changed so greatly. So something that we haven't noticed is that actually the royal modus operandi has evolved organically throughout the Queen's reign. It has been a gentle process of updating and change. And of course, that is its success. Because it's been gentle, people haven't really noticed it. That is also its Achilles heel, because it allows people to say, oh, they're stuck in a time warp. Well, only if you don't realize where they were 50, 60 years ago. The Queen has lived her entire life at some level within palace walls. She has never had the experience of the average person. And so it would be preposterous for me to claim that she is as in touch with ordinary people's lives as perhaps Some people may be, but she's also not as out of touch as we might be tempted to conclude.
Hmm. Let's start taking some questions. I've got tons of questions to throw at you, but I'm not going to hog them all. So let's take Suji, who's in the States. Go ahead, Sue.
Hi. Yeah, I'm curious as to this show on Netflix, The Crown. It was incredibly popular, and I found myself. I grew up in Hong Kong, and I can't say I'm a big supporter of the monarchy, but I was riveted by the series, which is sort of making me think I should probably read your book as well. But I'm curious how close to reality was, especially about her childhood, because she is presented as this child who was just bred for this and was unable to live any other way.
I'm going to split your question into two parts. I'll talk about the childhood first, and then we'll move on to the danger area of the crown. So the Queen appears to have been a sort of dazzling and magnetic child. Even if you strip some of the hyperbole of 1930s press reports away, there is a sense of a kind of enchanting golden-haired creature. She was described as bright as an atom of radium, which is, a kind of super techno-modern simile to use at the time. She didn't utter the kind of words that Queen Victoria did. Queen Victoria famously, when she discovered she was going to be queen, said, I will be good. And there's no evidence that the Queen said that, yet everything in her behavior suggests that that's what she was thinking. But I think without Queen Victoria's certainty, Queen Victoria went through her whole reign thinking she was being good, even when she was actually being really rather bad. I think our Queen, who is more personally modest, goes through her reign still trying to be good. It is the case that she was brought up to believe that, a primary virtue was self-control. Self-control was a synonym for good behavior, and self-control must affect every area of your life. From the moment that Margaret's personality began to emerge, when Margaret was only 2 or 3 years old, allowances were made for Margaret that weren't made for the current queen, and her parents reminded her that she was older and there was behavior expected of her. One of the Queen Mother's friends gave a talk to a local women's institute group in Sussex in the late 30s, where she talks about this idea of self-control having been absolutely pivotal to the Queen's upbringing. And the Queen has never shaken that off. And of course, through most of her reign, it's been regarded as a very good thing, but there have been key moments when it's been used as a kind of stick with which to beat her. And the most obvious is the aftermath of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, when the Queen behaved, by her standards, exceptionally well. She didn't lose control. She didn't wail and weep. She put her grandchildren first. And at the time, that simply wasn't regarded as an appropriate response. But there's a terrible irony to that, because this is happening very shortly after the Queen had been criticized for being a cold mother. So when she swings into action as a living grandmother, she's then criticized for doing precisely the opposite of what she'd earlier been criticized for. The deal with the crown is beautiful and compelling, and I think justly popular, because it makes for exceptionally good drama. But it really is drama. And I've spoken to other royal biographers in Britain who are troubled by the crown, and in fact, particularly when they go to the States, when people talk to them as if the crown is a kind of documentary about royal life, because it really does bend facts. And I feel that as series 3 and series 4 have emerged, it has become quite clear that the makers of the crown are not particularly well disposed towards the Queen herself. What emerges in those series, if you watch it as anything but a beautiful spectacle, is this sense that duty, which of course has always been the Queen's trump card, actually prevents her in some way from being a fully rounded human being. Duty in the crown becomes a synonym for coldness, for unfeelingness, for an inability to connect with other people, especially her children. But also there are moments when facts are just distorted. I don't know if you remember the episode when there is a crisis in Wilson's government, and there's an idea that there'll be a coup, and Lord Mountbatten will take over. And at that point, the Queen bizarrely decides to leave the country for 4 or 5 weeks to go and look at racehorses in France. But in fact, what happened is that the Queen went for 48 hours to see horses when this wasn't happening. The trip to America happened 16 years later in 1984 and lasts for 7 days. Yep, so we have a total of less than a fortnight out of the country, spread over 3 decades. But in The Crown, it all happens in one seminal month, and therefore suggests that here we have a woman who doesn't understand the seriousness of what's going on, who's much more interested in racing than the good of the country. And I feel that does a deep discredit to the Queen, particularly because the makers of that programme know that she will not protest, she won't complain, there won't be an explanation. And so the version that they put across will be, for many people, the accepted version. And I feel that, you know, after nearly 70 years on the throne, that is extraordinarily unkind.
Matthew, I'll come on to Harry and Meghan in a bit. I'm sure many other questions are going to have better questions than I have on this. But I do sense, this is my own, I'll give you my view for what it's worth, is that I believe in the monarchy, and it does give British people a sense of identity, and I think it does keep us all glued together. But I do find it difficult to see how that sense of deference to the monarchy can continue as society, you know, changes. I can't see a next generation happy to call, you know, William and Kate sir and bow and curtsy. I just think that although that sense of formality, that sense of respect for, you know, the hereditary monarchy, I don't think that's that desire to keep that going. I can't see it going for a long period of time, but I presume you think I'm wrong.
I don't think you're wrong, but I don't think the fact that people might be reluctant to do something means that it's the wrong thing to do. It may well be that certain outside markers of deference are dispensed with over time. I mean, for example, the Dutch royal family abolished curtsying in 1958. Our Queen hasn't, but she has also made it quite clear that she doesn't feel strongly that if people don't wish to bow or curtsy, then they don't have to. I would simply question a society in which you are reluctant to show respect to something. After all, it's important to remember that in bowing to the Queen, you are bowing to an embodiment of the nation. It is like people all over the globe standing up for their national anthems. And it is not an obeisance to her as a person. And so in the same way, somebody who bows to another member of the royal family is acknowledging their proximity to the crown and the standing of the monarchy, and the monarchy as an image of Britain.
Yeah, I'm not too sure how patient people are going to be with these norms that are being rapidly eroded. I hope I'm wrong. I hope you're right. Hilary Matthews has got a good question. Go ahead, Hilary.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
There have been many biographies written of the Queen. I looked it up just now, and there's quite a few, as I'm sure you know. What motivated you to write another one, and what do you feel you bring to the subject that is different or new from other biographies that have been written? And I'd just like to add a quick addendum to the Crown series, that as far as I understand it, it really is a work of fiction based on a few factual events. Thank you.
So the Crown, rather like Victoria, for anybody who watched Victoria, you know, plot lines in Victoria early on emerged from Queen Victoria's journals with distortion, and then later they simply left the journals behind. And obviously there is an element of that with the Crown. There have been enormous numbers of books about the Queen. And so when I was invited to write this book, it was actually a terrifying and daunting prospect. For me, this is my 9th book, and almost 7 of my previous books had been about women, and they had been about women, in every case, women of elite status.
Yeah, just run through some of the titles, Matthew, for those who don't know. Just say what you've written.
So I have written a book about George II's wife, Caroline of Ansbach, a fabulous early 18th century consort, a book called The First Iron Lady. I've written a biography of Queen Victoria. I've written a biography of Queen Victoria's youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, called The Last Princess. I've written a biography of Vita Sackville-West, the great gardener and poet and novelist. I've written a biography of Beatrix Potter. So a number of extraordinary women. And what emerged slightly by accident, I noticed that it had happened quite a long way, through my years of writing these books, is that what connects the books is that they are women of elite status who have struggled to achieve self-determinism, mostly on account of their gender and the gender politics of the time in which they lived. Now, here's the deal. Of course, the Queen has not struggled to achieve status because she had extraordinary status, greatness thrust upon her, as Shakespeare said. But she still became queen in a patriarchal society, and with an astonishing weight of expectation that she would carry out this role as the 2 most recent men in her family had done. And so what I wanted to explore was the extent to which the Queen is a kind of queen who had no choices, a queen of kind of fidelity to past models, a queen who was happy to put the institution first and accept the advice that she was given. Although there have been enormous numbers of books about the Queen, if you whittle those books down, that there haven't been a frightful number of what I would call serious books about the Queen. There have been any number of books that tell you, for example, the names of the corgis and that kind of thing. And I wanted to write a book about the Queen that somehow reached an assessment of her as practitioner of monarchy. So that was my motivation, and I hope that that's what I've brought to this book, this kind of overarching assessment, and a kind of window onto her extraordinary world throughout her 10 decades.
Hilary, you'll have to get it. The Daily Mail has only serialized part of the book, so not all 500 pages of it. So you'll have to go and buy the book to find out. Simon Jackson, next question. Go ahead, Simon.
Following on from something that Nick asked, the Queen alone has survived the death of deference, and Charles has come in for at least his share of pillorying. What are the consequences for the monarchy of that when Charles ascends to the top job?
So I think that what is happening and what we've seen happening over the last decade, and certainly since celebrations of the Prince of Wales' 70th birthday, is that there has been a kind of looking back and a weighing up of what his achievement has been, and therefore a kind of separating the working prince, the effective prince, from the man who was half of that disastrous marriage to the Princess of Wales, and also the man who so often looks slightly glum, slightly uncomfortable within his skin. My hope would be that when the Prince of Wales becomes king, there will be a sense of the role fitting him and him fitting the role, and so people perhaps won't have that feeling of discomfort that perhaps they've noticed. They won't also have lodged at the back of their mind that here must be a frustrated man. He must be desperate for his mother to die to get on with things. Obviously, once that's happened, that will stop being the case. And of course, the scandals of the past at that point seem to me so very far in the past. And I do think that the aura of monarchy will support him. He won't be as formal as the Queen. He isn't as formal as the Queen. So an aspect of the behavior that the Queen receives won't be accorded to him. But then it isn't always accorded to her. I noticed, for example, that when the Queen went to visit children in hospital after the Ariana Grande Manchester bomb scare. Nobody stood up when she walked into the hospital. There were parents sitting next to the beds, and the Queen approached the bed, and obviously the child couldn't move because it was in bed, but one might have assumed that at least the father would have got up out of his chair. But because one would assume you might do that for any woman, particularly an older woman, but not a bit of it. You know, these men continue to sit staring doggedly at their feet while our poor non-genarian monarch tried to make small talk to the tops of their heads.
Matthew, what do you think of that?
I think it's extraordinarily rude. And, you know, I wouldn't do it to my mother or grandmother, and I wouldn't do it to anybody else's mother or grandmother. But of course, you know, what does the Queen do? Well, she doesn't react at all.
But the sad thing is that whilst you and I might like that, we're out of fashion and we're out of date. And it's a reflection upon the fact that nobody really cares for those norms anymore. I mean, I just think it's being...
You know, I don't think that's the case. I think we do... There's something extraordinary going on with the Queen, which is that we see that she embodies standards that we are happy to dismiss as old-fashioned, that she embodies standards and practices and values that we are all happy not to practice in our own lives, but we still admire her for doing it. And I think that is part of her success. Yes, those are double standards, and it is true that you know, in that way she is out of sync with society. But I don't think society is saying those things are wrong.
Well, two people who are saying it's wrong are Meghan and Harry across the pond. Harry has said very clearly that he didn't want to inflict upon his children the same thing that has been inflicted upon him or his father. The implicit criticism of the Queen there. Meghan has made it clear that she sees part of the royal household as racist. Have they got it wrong?
Who, the royal household, the Queen, or Meghan and Harry?
Meghan and Harry.
I think what they have got wrong is to take what appear to be family-based differences and air them in a non-family forum. I think this seems to me a flawed path if what you're after is resolution.
So it's the fact that they've spoken about it publicly is the problem, not the thoughts they've had themselves.
Well, speaking about it publicly, but not to people who could do anything about it, is just not a way of achieving any kind of resolution, is it?
I guess it's the court of public opinion that could be seen as very effective because it comes onto your side, and then you know you're.
Yes, but interestingly not. I mean, isn't it interesting that we see we have a sense of impatience in Britain at the moment with the Sussexes, and I think, you know, for a number of reasons, but not least that we are hopefully emerging from a pandemic that has hit a number of people extraordinarily hard, that people across the globe have lost loved ones, that people have lost their livelihoods, that people have endured isolation and depression and terrible challenges on any number of fronts. And they see people who continue to lead lives of great privilege, but who appear to focus only on the aspects of their lives that are not perfect, at a moment when very few people's lives approach perfection.
Lynn Maddock. Lynn's in Australia. Go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, hi, Nicholas. And I'm not putting my camera on because I'm still in bed.
What time is it? What time is it?
Oh, about 5 o'clock a.m.
5 o'clock. Oh, you're marvelous. I love you. Well done.
From my point of view, we get the best of all worlds. We get a head of state that we don't have to pay for, who doesn't come to visit much, and who doesn't interfere much. So we're quite happy for you to keep the monarchy, so that we can freeload. The question I have, though, is, has the monarchy outlived its usefulness? The whole idea of British exceptionalism seems to have been cemented by the continuation of the monarchy, and that the UK may have been much better off in adjusting to its reduced role in the world if it didn't have the monarchy and the cement that the concrete, that has imposed upon you.
Explain that a bit further. So what do you mean by British exceptionalism, and how do you think the monarchy has enabled that?
I think that what I mean by it, I think, is that it's a sense that we have that Britain, particularly England, has a special place in the world, that as a bastion of democracy and civilized society and an ex-colonial power, that you have an enhanced view of your position in the world. How has the monarchy contributed to it? I think a ruder shock would have meant that you start adjusting to that earlier.
Matthew.
Well, I see that it's possible to see the monarchy as a kind of symbol of past greatness and a symbol, if you like, of kind of vanished grandeur, but only if you take what I hope in Britain we would regard as a short-term historical view, only if your view of Britain's past it focuses on the 19th century. I mean, I think what is more important is that the Queen is, whatever she is, our 41st sovereign since the Norman conquest. So she isn't, for us in Britain, an embodiment of imperial grandeur in the 19th century, though certain aspects of royal pageantry and certainly certain jewels that the Queen wears come from that period. She is part of a very long thread that stretches back to the unification of England under the Normans, and she is part of the long historical continuum of these islands. Do I think that internationally the monarchy seems to suggest that Britain is a greater power than it is? I can't answer that. You're probably better placed to answer that question than I am. It is certainly the case that the British Crown has an international reach that other monarchies don't have, because the Queen has this role as head of the Commonwealth, and because within that Commonwealth there are obviously 15 overseas realms which acknowledge the Queen as Crown, acknowledge the Queen, as monarch. But my understanding is that within those countries, a majority of people support that, and if they didn't, the Queen wouldn't oppose being removed. I mean, obviously countries like Malta, for example, in the 70s ceased to have the Queen as head of state and became a republic. So it is a criticism that is leveled at the monarchy by Republicans, that somehow it's a kind of clinging on to something, and the thing that it's clinging on to is this kind of period of empire from the sort of the final third of the 19th century up to the end of the Second World War, and it means that in Britain we don't get a grip and realize that we're not frightfully important anymore. But of course, the monarchy is so much more than that. It is an embodiment of our whole national heritage, and I hope that overseas it could also be a connection with the national heritage of those countries too.
But I guess if we look at our neighbours, it is anachronistic in that revolutions and wars have got rid of other monarchies that also, until that point, were 1,000 years old, or at least several hundred years old.
Yes, but not in all countries, and the oldest monarchy in Europe, in Denmark, survives.
Okay, but it's possible to have one, but I guess those take a far lesser role in their countries than ours does.
Yes, although the Queen has an executive role. She doesn't have considerable executive power anymore, and her executive power is essentially a blocking power, isn't it, constitutionally? I think the argument here is one that is always peddled, that somehow republicanism represents political maturity and monarchy represents political immaturity. I feel that's simply an oversimplification.
Okay, I'd love to get more questions, everyone. So do add more questions to the Q&A box here. There were elements that the thing that I'm amazed by is how well the Queen manages to keep up this sort of aura of the monarch, and how little we know about her own personal views, as you suggested. But there are a few flashes within the book that you show and perhaps I'd like you to talk about a few of them, just because I think they're good to people to know about. I can't help but pick upon the papers appearing in Balmoral when Fergie was exposed with her so-called financier, and the Queen's reaction to that.
And I'm sure in that case, the Queen's reaction was pretty much everybody else's reaction too. And indeed was exactly the reaction that Fergie herself realized that it inevitably would be. I mean, I think you can be self-controlled, you can be devoted to the good of an institution, but it doesn't mean that you have no human impulses. And the Queen strikes me as somebody who is mostly a patient person, but she did inherit her father's very formidable temper. And there are moments when that temper flashes out, and indeed those who have been on the receiving end have acknowledged it's very frightening.
Can you talk about other examples? They're in the book. They're in the book.
Well, you need to remind me.
We'll take some more questions and then go from there. Andy Mendes. Andy, I think Andy should be up. We'll be getting Andy Mendes' question in just a second. So Andy's question is just in front of me here. We may be having a problem getting some of these speakers online for some reason. I don't know. Here we go, Andy. There we go. There's Andy Mendes. Go ahead, Andy.
I've been promoted, Nicholas. Yeah, it's a very simple question, which is, does she really believe in God? But perhaps the more helpful question is, how do you think the established church works in the world that it finds itself? And particularly with Charles whittling on about whether the defender of faiths, where does that lead us, please?
I think that there can be little doubt that the Queen does have a very deep-rooted faith. It's interesting that the Vatican in 2017 acclaimed the Queen as the last Christian monarch. And of course, she has, although we tend to talk about her as a woman who hasn't expressed her views, what she has expressed very clearly, particularly in her Christmas broadcasts, and certainly post millennium, is the strength of her Christian faith and her attachment to Christian values as a sort of guide for her own life, her daily life. I think the Queen is fully cognizant that she is reigning over a multi-faith, multi-ethnic society in which church figures appear to be, church attendance figures appear to be in a state of continual decline. That has been the case throughout the Queen's role, save a very brief period in the early 50s when in the sort of post-war climate there was a kind of restored conservatism, a kind of a moral conservatism, a religious conservatism as well. The Queen has clearly taken seriously her role within the established church, but she has also been more ecumenical than previous British sovereigns. We know, for example, that Queen Victoria would occasionally look away when driving past a Catholic church, and the Queen Victoria, of course, had a particular hatred of bishops. I'm not aware that our own Queen feels that with quite such vehemence. Ray, the Prince of Wales, yes, of course, he did, in that unfortunate Dimbleby interview in '94, say that he would like to be defender of faiths. He has subsequently clawed back, and it appears no longer to be his view. How the church adjusts to a man of his views, particularly a man who is divorced and remarried, well, we'll have to see. But of course, the church itself has changed over the course of the Queen's reign, and even since 1994, when the Prince of Wales said that.
Yeah. Marty Ryan. Go ahead, Marty.
Thanks. I'm in the States. I have this understanding that the Queen reads all kinds of documents that come to her from Parliament, and then meets on some kind of regular basis with the Prime Minister to talk about political and current issues. Is that accurate?
Matthew, I think it's really worthwhile at this point just to actually run through some of the roles and that she has, just to give people a summary.
Can
then
I
also
answer the question and then segue into that?
Sure.
Okay. So the Queen is known as #1 reader, and on a daily basis, and it is a daily basis, when Parliament is sitting, she receives dispatches. She sees bills. She sees all parliamentary work in process. She also gets an account of the day's proceedings in Parliament. She likes them to be slightly humorous, so she wants a concise, accurate report of debates in Parliament over the course of the day. And if there can be just a degree of wryness, then I think she's profoundly grateful for that. It can take up as much as 3 hours of her day every single day. And there are stories of the Queen being, in theory, on a holiday at Balmoral, or staying with friends for a weekend, but then leaving at a certain point to go and work on her boxes. So that is absolutely true. She sees her prime ministers on a weekly basis. They have what's called an audience of Her Majesty when they go to the palace, or to Balmoral when she's there. And the Queen has described her role then as being a little bit like a sponge, that what she recognizes is that the Prime Minister can talk to her with absolute trust and say things that they wouldn't say to anybody else. The Queen doesn't offer opinions. She listens, and sometimes it is clear from the nature of her listening whether she is fully supportive or otherwise, but she would never express a view because these are explicitly political things, and she doesn't allow herself a political view. She does take it very seriously. So Harold Wilson, for example, in his first audience as Prime Minister, was caught up short because the Queen had been reading documents about the proposed building of a new town called Milton Keynes, and the Queen asked him about essentially affordable housing plans in Milton Keynes, and he didn't know anything about it. So she does keep herself fully informed, but I think because she's so convinced that that's part of her responsibility, that she, in her work as Queen, she is going out and about across Britain, meeting people, and she wants to have some sense of the things that are affecting people's lives at any given moment.
Great. Okay, Graham Fry.
Oh, thanks, Nicholas. Matthew, I was interested in your view on whether you feel that Prince Charles, because of the baggage he brings with him, might ultimately pass over his chance to be monarch to William as a way of stabilising the monarchy, if you like.
Obviously, I don't know the answer to that question, but here is my thought as somebody taking a long view. It is a dangerous precedent for monarchy to set that there can be an element of choice. The way monarchy works in Britain is the king is dead, long live the king, and it is a seamless transition, and we don't question the change in personnel. If you establish that there can be a principle of choice, even if it is one person handing over to another like this, then I think you question the possibility of inheritance by primogeniture, and indeed you question the whole validity of inheritance. Now, of course, we know that it has happened, and of course it famously happened in the abdication. It also happened in the Glorious Revolution of 1689. In both cases, just as we would have here with William, the next sovereign was a blood relative of the displaced sovereign. But in both cases, that was seen as a dangerous and kind of troubling transition, and one that could have opened a very unhelpful fissure. So of course, ultimately, that will be Prince Charles's choice. What at that point we have to think about is what has he absorbed from his parents and his grandparents about the sanctity of sovereignty. I would have thought that his grandmother, who lived throughout his formative years, and of course whose life was significantly shaped by the abdication, would have instilled an idea that a crown is not a rugby ball to be passed from one person to the next.
Can you talk briefly about what David Cameron did in terms of it's no longer the firstborn son who becomes monarch? I mean, that gives you an indication that there is a political acceptance that the rules can be changed.
Yes, the rules are changed, but of course, what the rules are staying the same in the sense that it's a firstborn child of a sovereign who becomes the next sovereign. So the rules reflected changes in society and changes in gender politics. It was a change that was approved by the palace, approved by the Queen. I think it was a change that was also approved by public opinion. Of course, as it happens, it's not going to have any effect until this point, the fourth generation, and it won't make a difference until Prince George marries and has children.
Okay, we've got another question from Suji. Go ahead, Sue.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering if you thought there might be any chance that the Queen would relinquish the crown to Charles.
The Queen said to a cousin that she would step down if she had a stroke or got Alzheimer's disease. And I think within that statement was a sort of a clear statement that she wouldn't abdicate for any other reason. I think part of this is that the Queen, of course, is an anointed sovereign. She isn't just somebody who had an interview and was given a job as a result of that interview. She made promises that she firmly believes were promises made before God, and they were promises that only she made, and they were lifelong promises, and she has fulfilled them lifelong so far. I think the only way that would change would be if her sense of the importance of the institution meant that she felt that her shortcomings, perhaps her physical or mental frailty, meant that she was endangering the stability of the crown. But of course, at that point, there can be a regency, and the Prince of Wales could become Prince Regent, as George IV did, and the Queen will still remain in name the sovereign. I mean, certainly the Queen's response to abdications across Europe, there was a kind of bumper year when everybody, including the Pope, stepped down, and the Queen's response, was not that was necessarily something she was interested in following.
Okay, Matthew, I think it'd be very interesting to tell people how you did the work for this book. And one person has asked, have you met the Queen? That seems like an odd question to ask, but then not an odd question for somebody who's just written a book about her life.
Well, the short answer is yes, I have met the Queen, but I didn't meet the Queen as part of the writing of this book. The Queen doesn't talk to writers, she doesn't talk to biographers, she doesn't talk to journalists. And so that is not a possibility, and I didn't broach it with the palace as a possibility. With my 3 previous royal biographies, I was helped by the Royal Archives, which is the collection of documents within the Crown's own possession relating to the royal family. When I came to write this book, I wasn't helped by the Royal Archives because they are holding back documents for an official biography of the Queen that will be commissioned after her death. It would also be the case that the Royal Archives would never allow one to see documents relating to a living person. So I always knew that wouldn't be the case. So inevitably, I spoke to people with connections to the court.
Just to jump in there, that means it's very difficult to. They're very protective of those documents. In some ways, they're deliberately obstructive. They don't want people to do what you're doing.
I don't think so. I think, hey, if the Queen wrote a journal like Queen Victoria, I would think, oh my goodness, if only I can get my hands on that. Because Queen Victoria's journal in its unexpurgated form, before one of my previous subjects, Princess Beatrice, rewrote most of it, it was dynamite stuff. And a very accurate showcase of her astonishing vehemence and feistiness. But the Queen has always said that her diary is actually much closer to the diary of her grandfather, George V, which is an exceptionally dull document of about 2.5 to 3 lines a day, mostly recording the weather and a kind of literal account of what he did and when, without reflection. And so, you know, the Queen's Diary will be fabulous at giving us a picture of her working life and her activities and where she is at a certain point. But I don't think it will necessarily irradiate her personality in the way perhaps that Queen Victoria's done.
Your biography does sort of stress that there's a sort of, you know, succession of public engagements, gifts, you know, greetings that just go on and on, week after week after week after week, which be enough to really make most people want to retire.
Because of course, you know, we have got a woman who, until the pandemic, in her mid-90s, was still carrying out 400 public engagements a year. It has been an astonishingly busy life.
Well, Matthew, thank you very much indeed. Here it is. I'm sure I think it's available in the States, isn't it? And Australia at the moment. I think, Matthew, is that right?
It's published in the States in September.
In September. Wonderful. Excellent. Well, it's worth, there's a lot I didn't know about. It's worth getting. Thank you very much indeed, Matthew. It's been a wonderful hour. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.